David Stevens's heart raced as he stepped into the xenobiology lecture hall at Starfleet Academy. His alien professor, a Bajoran female in her early 30s named Quasar, was entering her mating season. She couldn't resist him, and he was about to find out why. The 22-year-old human male had enrolled in the Interspecies exchange program, eager to expand his knowledge of the universe. Little did he know, his first day would thrust him into a life-or-death situation with far-reaching consequences. Professor Quasar stood at the podium, her usual composure noticeably absent. She fidgeted, her words coming out in short, staccato bursts. Sweat beaded on her forehead, and her eyes darted around the room, refusing to settle on any one student for too long. David leaned forward, concern etched on his face. Something was clearly wrong with the professor. As the lecture progressed, her agitation grew. She stumbled over simple concepts, her hands shaking as she attempted to operate the holographic display. When class ended, David approached the podium. "Professor Quasar, are you feeling all right?" The moment he drew near, a change came over her. Her nostrils flared, and her eyes locked onto him with an intensity that made him step back. In a flash, she lunged forward, grabbing his shirt and pulling him close. "You!" she growled, her voice thick with desire. "I need you." David's body responded in ways he couldn't understand. His heart pounded, and heat coursed through his veins. With a strength he didn't know he possessed, he broke free from her grasp and fled the classroom. Hours later, his communicator chirped. It was a message from the Academy's alien biology department. The words on the screen made his blood run cold. "Mr. Stevens, we have an urgent situation. Professor Quasar is experiencing PON-FAR, a biological mating cycle that occurs every 7 years in Bajorans. If she doesn't mate within 48 hours, she will die." David's mind reeled. He read on, learning that Bajoran pheromones had an unusually strong effect on human males. Due to this unique interaction, he was the only compatible match on campus. The message continued, outlining his options. He could agree to mate with Professor Quasar, saving her life and potentially strengthening human-Bajoran relations. Or he could refuse, letting her die and possibly damaging interspecies diplomacy. As David grappled with this impossible choice, reports flooded in of anti-alien protests erupting on Earth. Groups decried the corruption of human genetics and demanded an end to interspecies programs. David sat on his bed, head in his hands. The fate of a woman's life, his academic future, and possibly the relationship between two species rested on his shoulders. And all the while, his body thrummed with an unfamiliar energy, a primal response to Quasar's pheromones that he couldn't shake. Time was running out. Professor Quasar couldn't resist him, and now David had to decide if he could resist her, in the weight of responsibility that came with their unexpected connection. David's finger hovered over the communicator, his mind racing with the implications of his choice. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him, making each breath a conscious effort. He glanced at the clock. 24 hours had passed since he'd received the message about Professor Quasar's condition. Unable to bear the burden alone any longer, David turned to his roommate, Jack Thompson. Jack listened intently as David explained the situation, his brow furrowing with each new detail. "This is way above our pay grade, man," Jack said, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "Have you thought about reaching out to Earth's diplomatic corps? They might have some insight." David nodded, grateful for the suggestion. With trembling hands, he initiated a call to the Earth Embassy on Bajor. After a series of transfers, he found himself face-to-face with Ambassador Marcus Cole on the monitor. The ambassador's weathered face creased with concern as David recounted the events of the past day. "Mr. Stevens, I cannot overstate the delicacy of this situation," Cole said, his voice grave. "The death of a Bajoran professor due to human inaction could have severe diplomatic repercussions. However, the choice must ultimately be yours." Swallowing hard, David made his decision. "I'll do it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Hours later, David found himself in the sterile environment of the Academy's medical bay. The air felt thick with tension as he approached the bed where Professor Quasar lay. Her skin was flushed, a sheen of sweat glistening on her forehead. Her eyes locked onto David, filled with a mixture of relief and primal hunger. Dr. Talar, a Vulcan physician, stood nearby, her face a mask of professional detachment. "Mr. Stevens, Professor Quasar," she began, her voice calm and measured. "I will oversee this procedure to ensure both your safety and the successful alleviation of the PON-FAR symptoms." As David stepped closer, a wave of pheromones hit him, igniting a fire in his veins. His vision swam, and he gripped the edge of the bed to steady himself. Dr. Talar moved swiftly, administering a hypospray to both David and Professor Quasar. "A mild sedative," she explained. "It will help maintain control during the initial stages of the mating ritual." With the doctor's guidance, David and Professor Quasar began the preliminary ritual. Their hands touched, fingers intertwining. The contact sent a jolt through David's system, and he gasped as a flood of sensations washed over him. Suddenly, he wasn't just David Stevens anymore. He was also Adasa, a young girl on Bajor, hiding from Cardassian patrols. He felt her fear, her willpower, her hope for a better future. The memories flashed by in rapid succession. Her first day at the academy, her pride at becoming a professor, the loneliness of being far from home. "Adasa," David whispered, the name feeling right on his tongue. Professor Quasar's eyes widened in surprise, then softened with understanding. "David," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. As they continued the ritual, alarms blared throughout the medical bay. Dr. Talar rushed to a nearby console, her fingers flying over the controls. "We have a security breach," she announced, her usual Vulcan calm tinged with urgency. "Anti-alien protesters have entered the academy grounds." The door to the medical bay slid open, revealing Security Chief Renar. The Andorian's antennae twitched with agitation as he surveyed the room. "We have a hostage situation in the main auditorium," Renar reported. "The group calls themselves Earth First. They're demanding an end to all interspecies programs and the deportation of alien faculty." David felt a surge of panic that wasn't entirely his own. Through the psychic bond, he sensed Adasa's fear spike. "Zara," she gasped. "My research assistant. She's in the auditorium for a lecture." Dr. Talar's voice cut through the chaos. "We must complete the mating process within the next 12 hours, she stated. "The additional stress is accelerating the PON-FAR symptoms. If we delay, there may be permanent neurological damage." David's mind reeled. He looked from Adasa to Security Chief Renar, torn between his commitment to save the professor and his desire to help determination the hostage crisis. The psychic bond pulsed with Adasa's concern for Zara, mingling with his own growing feelings for the professor. Outside the academy walls, the galaxy was taking notice. News of the hostage situation spread like wildfire across subspace channels. The Bajoran government issued a strongly worded statement, demanding immediate action to protect their citizens. In the chambers of the United Federation of Planets, an emergency session convened to address the crisis. David stood at the crossroads of a pivotal moment in interstellar relations. His next move would not only determine the fate of Professor Quasar and the hostages, but could reshape the future of human-alien interactions. The weight of galaxies seemed to rest on his shoulders as he contemplated his next move. With a deep breath, David turned to Security Chief Renar, his decision made. "What can I do to help?" David turned to Security Chief Renar, his mind racing with possibilities. "I have an idea," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. "Let me negotiate with the Earth First group. I'm in a unique position to bridge the gap between humans and aliens." Renar's antennae twitched skeptically. "It's too dangerous. You're not trained for hostage situations." "But I'm the only one who can truly understand both sides," David argued. "Through my bond with Professor Quasar, I've gained insights into Bajoran culture, and as a human, I can relate to the protesters' concerns, even if I disagree with their methods." The Andorian security chief considered for a moment, then nodded reluctantly. "Very well, but we'll be monitoring closely and ready to intervene at the first sign of trouble." Dr. Talar approached, hypospray in hand. "Before you go, Mr. Stevens, I must administer a temporary suppressant to Professor Quasar. It will buy us a few more hours, but we must act quickly." As the Vulcan doctor tended to Adasa, David felt a surge of concern through their psychic link. He sent back a wave of reassurance, marveling at the depth of their connection. "Be careful," Adasa whispered, her eyes locked on his. David nodded, then steeled himself for the task ahead. He made his way to the main auditorium, his heart pounding with each step. Outside the doors, he took a deep breath and entered. The scene inside was tense. A group of about a dozen humans, led by a muscular man with close-cropped hair, held several alien faculty members and students at gunpoint. The leader's eyes widened in recognition as David approached. "Well, well," the man sneered. "If it isn't the alien lover himself, come to join the party, David Stevens." David raised his hands in a placating gesture. "I'm here to talk, nothing more. What's your name?" "Victor Graves," the leader replied, his weapon trained on David. "And we're done talking. It's time for action. We demand an end to all interspecies programs and the immediate deportation of every alien on Earth." David felt a flicker of insight through his bond with Adasa. He drew upon her diplomatic experience as he chose his next words carefully. "Victor, I understand your concerns. Change can be frightening, especially when it comes to our interactions with other species. But consider the advancements we've made because of our cooperation with aliens." Victor scoffed. "Advancements? All I see is the corruption of human genetics and the erosion of our way of life." As David engaged Victor in debate, he scanned the room, assessing the situation. His gaze fell on a young Bajoran woman he recognized as Zara, Adasa's research assistant. She was inching slowly towards a decorative wall hanging, her movements almost imperceptible. Realizing what Zara was attempting, David decided to create a distraction. He took a step closer to Victor, his voice rising. "And what about the countless human lives saved by alien medical technology, or the colonies we've established using their terraforming techniques?" Victor's face reddened with anger. "Those colonies should be for humans only. We don't need alien interference in our expansion." As Victor became more agitated, David noticed Zara slip her hand behind the wall hanging. He needed to keep the Earth-First leader focused on him for just a few more seconds. "So you'd rather humanity stagnate?" David challenged. "Remain isolated and ignorant while the rest of the galaxy moves forward without us?" Victor lunged forward, grabbing David by the shirt. "You traitorous piece of—" A sudden, high-pitched whine filled the air, cutting off Victor's words. The Earth-First members looked around in confusion as their weapons powered down, rendered useless by the electromagnetic pulse Zara had activated. In the moment of chaos, David acted. He twisted out of Victor's grasp and shouted, "Now!" The alien hostages sprang into action, tackling their captors. David grappled with Victor, using techniques he'd learned in basic academy training. Within moments, Security Chief Renard and his team burst into the auditorium, quickly subduing the remaining Earth-First members. As Victor was led away in restraints, he spat at David's feet. "This isn't over. Earth for humans!" David barely heard him. Through his bond with Adasa, he felt a wave of pain and urgency. Without a word to Renard or the others, he sprinted from the auditorium, racing back to the medical bay. Dr. Talar met him at the door, her normally impassive face showing a hint of concern. "The suppressant is losing effectiveness faster than anticipated. We must proceed with the mating ritual immediately." David nodded, his breath coming in short gasps. "What do I need to do?" The Vulcan doctor led him to a private medical suite, explaining as they walked. "I will monitor your vital signs throughout the process. The Ponfar is an intense biological event, and the combination of human and Bajoran physiology is unprecedented." As they entered the room, David saw Adasa on the bed, her skin flushed and glistening with sweat. Their eyes met, and he felt a surge of emotion through their bond. Fear, desire, and something deeper he couldn't quite name. "David," Adasa whispered, reaching out to him. He took her hand, and the world fell away. They were no longer in the sterile medical suite, but on a sun-drenched beach on Bajor. David felt the warm sand between his toes, heard the cry of alien seabirds, tasted salt on the air. As they began the final stages of the Bajoran mating ritual, David experienced a flood of memories and sensations. He was a child on Bajor, marveling at the sight of her first wormhole. He was a cadet at Starfleet Academy, nervous and excited on his first day of classes. The intensity of the experience grew, and David lost all sense of time and self. He and Adasa moved as one, their bodies and minds perfectly in sync. Waves of pleasure and pain washed over them, building to a crescendo that seemed to shake the very foundations of reality. In the midst of this storm of sensation, neither David nor Adasa noticed Dr. Tilar's expression change from clinical detachment to intense fascination. The Vulcan's fingers flew over her medical tricorder, recording data that would soon rock the scientific community to its core. As the mating ritual reached its peak, David and Adasa cried out in unison. A blinding light seemed to explode behind David's eyes, and then darkness. When David regained consciousness, he found himself still in the medical suite, Adasa sleeping peacefully beside him. He felt different, changed in ways he couldn't quite articulate. Dr. Tilar approached, her eyes gleaming with barely held-back excitement. "Mr. Stevens, Professor Quasar, I believe we have made a most fascinating discovery." "Discovery?" the Vulcan doctor said, her voice uncharacteristically animated. "The genetic implications of your union are unprecedented." David blinked, struggling to process her words through the fog of post-ritual exhaustion. Beside him, Adasa stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "What do you mean, doctor?" David asked, his throat dry. Dr. Tilar's fingers danced across her medical tricorder. "During your mating ritual, I observed a temporary alteration in both of your genetic structures. It appears that your DNA has briefly aligned in a way that could potentially allow for viable human Bajoran offspring." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. David felt a surge of emotions through his bond with Adasa. Shock, wonder, and a hint of fear. "Are you saying—" Adasa's voice trailed off, unable to complete the thought. "That a pregnancy is possible," Dr. Tilar finished. "Yes, Professor Quasar, though I must emphasize that this is merely a possibility, not a certainty." David reached for Adasa's hand, finding comfort in her touch as they grappled with this unexpected development. The peaceful aftermath of their union was shattered by the chirping of the room's communication panel. "Mr. Stevens, Professor Quasar," came the stern voice of Chancellor Vorik, the Academy's Vulcan administrator. "Your presence is required immediately in the main conference room. There have been developments." As they made their way through the Academy's corridors, David noticed the furtive glances and hushed whispers of passing students and faculty. News of the hostage situation had clearly spread, and he could feel the weight of their stares. The conference room was a scene of controlled chaos. Chancellor Vorik stood at the head of the table, his face an impassive mask. Security Chief Renard paced near the windows, his antennae twitching with agitation. Dr. Tilar took her place beside the Chancellor, her earlier excitement now carefully contained. "Mr. Stevens, Professor Quasar," Chancellor Vorik began without preamble, "the events of the past 24 hours have escalated beyond the confines of this academy. We are now facing a situation with far-reaching galactic implications." The holoscreen behind him flickered to life, displaying a series of news reports from across the Federation. David's stomach churned as he saw footage of protesters on Earth and Bajor, their signs bearing slogans like, "Keep Earth Pure" and "Protect Bajoran Heritage." "Death threats have been made against both of you," Renard said, his voice tight. "Extremist groups on both planets are calling for drastic action." Adasa's grip on David's hand tightened. Through their bond, he could feel her fear and uncertainty mingling with his own. "Furthermore," Chancellor Vorik continued, "Dr. Tilar's preliminary findings on your genetic alterations have been leaked to the public." David's head snapped up. "What? How?" "We are investigating the source of the leak," Renard growled. "But the damage is done. The news has spread faster than a Ferengi rumor at a trade negotiation." The holoscreen shifted to show debates raging across scientific forums, religious leaders issuing proclamations, and politicians scrambling to address the issue. "In light of these developments," Chancellor Vorik said, "the United Federation of Planets has demanded a full investigation into the incident. For your own safety, we have no choice but to relocate you to a secure facility on a neutral planet." The news hit David like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to protest, but a sudden vibration from his personal communicator stopped him. A message from his father, Admiral John Stevens, flashed on the screen. "Son, we need to talk. Earth's government is pressuring me. Call immediately." As David stared at the message, torn between duty and family, Adasa leaned close. "David," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I'm scared. The Bajoran spiritual leaders, they're calling for my excommunication. I don't know if I can handle losing my faith on top of everything else." Before David could respond, the door to the conference room slid open. A harried-looking aide rushed in, whispering urgently to Chancellor Vorik. The Vulcan's eyebrow rose fractionally, the closest he ever came to showing surprise. "It seems," Vorik said, addressing the room, "that we have received an unexpected offer of assistance. Dr. Tekani Gaymore, a prominent Cardassian geneticist, has proposed to study your unique genetic alterations. He believes this research could lead to significant medical breakthroughs for multiple species." A tense silence fell over the room. The history between Cardassia, Earth, and Bajor was fraught with conflict and mistrust. Accepting Cardassian help would be controversial, to say the least. "Chancellor," Renar began, his tone cautious, "while the scientific potential is intriguing, we must consider the political ramifications. This could be seen as—" The Andorian's words were cut off by another interruption. This time, the aide's face was pale with shock. "Sir," she said, her voice shaking, "there's been an attack. Zara, Professor Quasar's research assistant, she's been hospitalized. Extremists, sir. They're claiming responsibility." The room erupted into a flurry of activity. As Security Chief Renar barked orders into his communicator and Chancellor Vorik conferred urgently with Dr. Tillar, David turned to Adasa. Her face was a mask of horror, tears welling in her eyes. "This is our fault," she whispered. "Zara, she's innocent in all this. And now—" David pulled her close, feeling the tremors running through her body. Through their bond, he sensed her guilt, fear, and a deep aching sorrow. He wanted to offer words of comfort, to tell her everything would be all right, but he knew such platitudes would ring hollow. Instead, he simply held her, their shared emotions swirling between them like a turbulent sea. As the chaos of the room faded into the background, David realized they stood at a crossroads. Their next decisions would shape not only their own lives, but potentially the future of interspecies relations throughout the galaxy. The weight of that responsibility settled over them like a heavy cloak. With Zara's attack serving as a stark reminder of the dangers they faced, the offer from the Cardassian geneticist loomed large in David's mind. It was a chance for scientific progress, a way to perhaps ease the political tensions by providing a common goal. But it would also mean prolonging their time in the public eye, delaying their retreat to safety. As if reading his thoughts, Adasa pulled back slightly, her eyes meeting his. "What are we going to do, David?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Before he could answer, Chancellor Vorik approached, his face grave. "Mr. Stevens, Professor Quasar, I apologize for the interruption, but time is of the essence. We need your decision regarding Dr. Gaymore's offer. And Mr. Stevens, your father is holding on a secure channel. He says it's urgent." David took a deep breath, feeling the weight of galaxies on his shoulders. With Adasa's hand in his, he turned to face the Chancellor, ready to make a decision that would alter the course of their lives and potentially reshape the future of the galaxy. David squeezed Adasa's hand, drawing strength from their connection. He turned to face Chancellor Vorik, his decision made. "We'll accept Dr. Gaymore's offer," David said, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. "The potential benefits for interspecies medical advancements are too significant to ignore." Adasa nodded, her eyes reflecting a mix of fear and persistence. "We understand the risks, but we believe this is the right course of action." Chancellor Vorik's eyebrow raised a fraction. "A logical choice, given the circumstances. I will make the necessary arrangements immediately." Within hours, David and Adasa found themselves aboard a Federation transport en route to Babel. The neutral planet, known for its diplomatic neutrality, would be their new home for the foreseeable future. As they approached the research facility, David marveled at its sleek design. The state-of-the-art complex stood out against Babel's arid landscape, its high security measures evident even from a distance. Dr. Takani Gemore greeted them as they disembarked. The middle-aged Cardassian's reputation for controversial yet groundbreaking research preceded him. "Welcome to Babel," Dr. Gemore said, his scaled face set in a neutral expression. "I assure you, your safety and comfort are our top priorities." He led them through the facility's winding corridors, introducing his team along the way. "This is Dr. Alara, our Trill geneticist," he said, gesturing to a woman with distinctive spots running down her neck. "And Dr. Vorin, our Vulcan medical expert." The next weeks passed in a whirlwind of medical examinations and genetic mapping. David and Adasa spent hours in labs, their bodies and minds probed and analyzed. In their free time, they explored the facility's recreational areas, finding solace in each other's company. One evening, as they sat in the facility's arboretum, David felt a wave of homesickness wash over him. Without a word, Adasa took his hand, her emotions flowing through their strengthened bond. "I miss Earth too," she whispered, answering his unspoken thought. "But I'm glad we're here together." Their moment of peace was shattered by Dr. Gemore's urgent summons. In the main lab, the Cardassian's eyes gleamed with excitement. "We've made a breakthrough," he announced, gesturing to a holographic display. "Professor Quasar, you're pregnant, and the fetus. It's a viable human Bajoran hybrid." The news hit them like a physical force. David steadied Adasa as she swayed, her face a mix of joy and terror. "How is this possible?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Alara stepped forward, her spots seeming to shimmer in the lab's harsh light. "The genetic alterations you both experienced during the Ponfar created a unique compatibility. It's unprecedented." As the implications sank in, alarms blared throughout the facility. Dr. Vorin's fingers flew across a control panel. "Security breach," the Vulcan reported, his calm voice at odds with the urgency of the situation. "Extremist groups have breached the outer defenses." Dr. Gemore's face hardened. "Activate the emergency protocols. Mr. Stevens, Professor Quasar, please follow me." They rushed through the corridors, the sound of distant explosions growing louder. In a secure room, Dr. Gemore handed them each a small device. "Personal force field generators," he explained. "They'll provide an extra layer of protection." Adasa activated hers, a shimmering bubble of energy enveloping her. She placed a protective hand over her still flat stomach, her eyes meeting David's. Through their bond, David felt her fear, but also a fierce purpose. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The door slid open, revealing a familiar face that made David's blood run cold. Victor Graves, the escaped extremist leader, stood before them, flanked by armed followers. "This ends now," Graves snarled, his eyes fixed on Adasa's midsection. "We won't allow this abomination to continue." As Graves raised his weapon, David moved instinctively, placing himself between the threat and Adasa. The force field generators hummed to life, creating a barrier between them and the intruders. In that moment, surrounded by danger and uncertainty, David realized that their lives had irrevocably changed. The child growing within Adasa represented not just their love, but a potential bridge between worlds, a future that some would kill to prevent, and others would die to protect. The force field generators hummed, creating a barrier between them and the intruders, but David knew it wouldn't hold forever. Victor Graves and his followers were determined, their weapons already probing for weaknesses in the energy shield. Suddenly, alarms blared throughout the facility. Dr. Gemore's voice crackled over the intercom. "Emergency evacuation protocol initiated. All personnel proceed to designated safe zones immediately." David felt a firm hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Dr. Gemore, his scaled face set in steadfast perseverance. "We must move. Now!" Without waiting for a response, the Cardassian geneticist ushered David and Adasa through a hidden panel in the wall. As it slid shut behind them, muffling the sounds of weapons fire, they found themselves in a narrow, dimly lit passageway. "Emergency tunnels," Dr. Gemore explained as they hurried along, "designed for situations exactly like this." They ran through the winding corridors, the distant sounds of combat echoing through the facility above. David held Adasa's hand tightly, acutely aware of her labored breathing and the precious life growing within her. Suddenly, Adasa stumbled, her free hand flying to her temple. "David," she gasped, her eyes wide with shock. I can sense them. The attackers, their minds, their intentions." Dr. Gaymore's eyebrows rose. "Fascinating. It seems your telepathic abilities have undergone significant enhancement." David steadied Adasa, concern etched on his face. "What do you mean? What are you sensing?" Adasa's eyes darted back and forth, as if seeing through the very walls of the tunnel. "They're spreading out, searching methodically. A group of 5, no, 6 are heading towards the main lab. Another squad is securing the living quarters." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Graves. He's leading a team directly towards us. They know about these tunnels." Dr. Gemmer's face hardened. "Then we must move faster. This way." They picked up their pace, with Adasa providing constant updates on the purist movements. Her newfound ability allowed them to navigate the maze-like tunnels, avoiding detection with mere seconds to spare. After what felt like hours of tense evasion, they emerged into a vast hangar bay. The space was dominated by a sleek, angular craft, unlike anything David had ever seen. "The Shadowhawk," Dr. Gaymore announced with a hint of pride. "A prototype stealth shuttle capable of interstellar travel. It's our best chance of escape." As they approached the craft, Dr. Alara and Dr. Voren emerged from another tunnel entrance, accompanied by a small security team. The group quickly began preparations for launch, with Dr. Gaymore inputting a series of complex codes to bring the Shadowhawk systems online. Just as the shuttle's engines began to hum to life, the hangar doors exploded inward. Victor Graves strode through the smoke, flanked by heavily armed followers. "You can't escape what you are," Graves shouted, his face contorted with rage. "That abomination growing inside her will never see the light of day." The security team sprang into action, taking up defensive positions around the shuttle. David, drawing on his Starfleet Academy training, grabbed a phaser from a nearby weapons locker and joined them. The air filled with the sizzle of energy weapons as both sides exchanged fire. David's heart raced as he returned fire, acutely aware of Adasa's vulnerable position behind him. In the chaos of the firefight, Dr. Alara cried out in pain, a glancing shot catching her in the shoulder. Dr. Voren, seeing the purist advancing, made a split-second decision. "Go!" the Vulcan shouted, sealing the shuttle's entrance behind the others. "I will delay them." Before anyone could protest, Dr. Voren charged towards the purist, drawing their fire. His sacrifice bought the precious seconds needed for Dr. Gaymore to lift off. As the Shadowhawk rose from the hangar floor, David caught a final glimpse of Dr. Voren falling under a barrage of weapons fire. The image seared itself into his memory as the shuttle shot out of the hangar and into the star-filled sky. The Shadowhawk's stealth systems engaged, rendering them invisible to conventional sensors. Dr. Gaymore's hands flew over the controls, plotting a course that would take them far from Babel in the reach of Earth or Bajoran authorities. "Where are we going?" David asked, still breathless from the narrow escape. Dr. Gaymore's eyes remained fixed on the navigation console. "The neutral zone. It's our best hope for sanctuary." As the stars streaked by outside the viewport, David turned to Adasa. She sat in one of the shuttle's medical beds, her face pale but determined. Dr. Alara, her own wound hastily treated, hovered over her with a medical tricorder. "David," Adasa called, her voice tinged with a mix of wonder and fear. "Something's happening. The baby. It's growing so fast." Dr. Alara's eyes widened as she studied the tricorder readings. "Incredible. The fetus's development is accelerated far beyond normal parameters. We need to stabilize her condition immediately." As Dr. Gaymore piloted the Shadowhawk deeper into uncharted space, David held Adasa's hand, watching in awe and trepidation as her body underwent rapid changes. Their child, a unique fusion of human and Bajoran DNA, was developing at an unprecedented rate. The shuttle's communication system suddenly crackled to life. A familiar voice filled the cabin, causing David's heart to skip a beat. "This is Admiral John Stevens," his father's voice rang out, tight with urgency. "If you're receiving this, you've made it off Babel. Listen carefully. I'm transmitting coordinates for a hidden space station. It's your only chance. As the encrypted message played out, detailing the existence of a secret faction within Starfleet in a hidden sanctuary, David's mind reeled. The universe he thought he knew was unraveling around him, replaced by a reality far more complex and dangerous. Dr. Gamor input the provided coordinates, pushing the Shadowhawk's experimental engines to their limits. As they raced towards this promised sanctuary, Adassa's pregnancy progressed at an alarming rate, and the shuttle's sensors detected multiple ships in pursuit. David looked out at the star-filled void, acutely aware that the fate of his family, and perhaps the entire galaxy, hung in the balance. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew they would face them together. Together. The Shadowhawk's engines hummed as it raced towards the coordinates provided by Admiral Stevens, carrying its precious cargo into the unknown. As they approached their destination, a massive structure materialized against the backdrop of stars. Unity Station loomed before them, its sleek design unlike any space station David had ever seen. The Shadowhawk slipped through an opening in the station's shimmering energy field, touching down in a cavernous docking bay. No sooner had they disembarked than alarms blared throughout the station. Dr. Gamor's eyes widened as he checked a nearby console. Multiple ships approaching, Earth, Bajoran, and purest vessels. David's heart raced as he helped Adassa out of the shuttle. Her pregnancy had progressed at an alarming rate during their journey, and she now appeared to be in the final stages of gestation. As if in response to the alarms, she doubled over, gasping. "The baby," Adassa breathed, her eyes meeting David's with a mixture of fear and wonder. "It's coming." A medical team led by a Vulcan woman in a crisp white uniform rushed towards them. "I am Dr. T'Prel," she announced, her voice calm despite the chaos around them. "We must get her to the medical bay immediately." As they hurried through Unity's winding corridors, David felt the station shudder. Through viewports, he caught glimpses of energy weapons impacting the station's shields. The pursuing ships had opened fire. The medical bay was a flurry of activity when they arrived. Dr. T'Prel and her team worked with practiced efficiency, preparing for the unprecedented birth of a human Bajoran hybrid. David remained by Adassa's side, their psychic bond allowing him to share in her pain and provide emotional support. "Breathe," he urged, squeezing her hand. Through their connection, he felt her fear, her perseverance, and something else, a presence growing stronger by the moment. The birth process proved more complicated than anticipated. Adassa's unique physiology, altered by the accelerated pregnancy, reacted unpredictably to standard medical procedures. Dr. T'Prel's expression remained neutral, but David sensed her growing concern. "We must adapt," the Vulcan doctor announced, her fingers flying over a medical console. "I am integrating human and Bajoran medical practices with experimental procedures. It is our best chance for a successful delivery." As Adassa's labor intensified, the lights in the medical bay flickered. Dr. Gamor burst in, his scaled face etched with worry. "The child," he said, gesturing to Adassa's swollen belly. "Its developing brain is emitting unusual energy patterns. It's interfering with Unity's systems." Another tremor shook the station, more violent than before. David gritted his teeth, torn between his concern for Adassa and the battle raging outside. As if sensing his conflict, Adassa gripped his hand tighter. "Stay," she whispered, her eyes locking with his. "Our child needs you here." Hours passed in a blur of pain, sweat, and flickering lights. The medical team worked tirelessly, adjusting their approach as Adassa's body continued to defy their expectations. Through it all, David remained a steady presence, his mind intertwined with Adassa's through their bond. Suddenly, a new voice filled the medical bay, broadcast through the station's comm system. "This is Admiral John Stevens," David's father announced, his tone urgent but controlled. "To all ships in the vicinity of Unity Station, I urge you to cease fire immediately. What's happening here today is bigger than our individual conflicts. We stand on the brink of a new era in interspecies relations." As if in response to the Admiral's words, Adassa let out a final, powerful cry. The lights in the medical bay surged brightly, then went out entirely. In the darkness, David heard a new sound, the unmistakable cry of a newborn child. Emergency lighting flickered to life, bathing the room in a soft glow. Dr. Teprell stood at the foot of the bed, cradling a small wriggling form. "Congratulations," she said, her voice carrying a hint of awe that belied her Vulcan composure. "You have a daughter." David's breath caught in his throat as the doctor placed the baby in Adassa's arms. The child was a perfect blend of her parents. Delicate ridges graced her forehead, softer than a full Bajoran's, and her eyes, when they fluttered open, seemed to shift color in the dim light. "She's beautiful," Adassa whispered, tears streaming down her face. David could only nod, overcome with emotion as he gently traced his daughter's cheek. The moment was interrupted by Dr. Gilmore rushing back into the medical bay. "The birth," he said, his eyes wide with excitement. "It released an energy pulse that disabled weapon systems on all the ships outside. We have an opportunity for peace." As if to confirm his words, Admiral Stevens's voice once again filled the station. "I am calling for an immediate diplomatic conference," he announced. "Representatives from Earth, Bajor, the Federation, and yes, even the genetic purists are invited to Unity Station. It's time we address this situation and discuss the implications of what's happened here today." David and Adassa exchanged a look, both understanding the weight of the moment. Their daughter, born of two worlds, had already changed the course of history. As delegates began to arrive on Unity Station and preparations for the conference got underway, they knew that the greatest challenges and opportunities still lay ahead. Dr. Teprell approached, her face serious despite the momentous occasion. "I must inform you," she began, her voice low, "that your daughter's development continues to progress at an unprecedented rate. Her brain activity is extraordinary. We may be dealing with abilities beyond our current understanding." David looked down at his daughter, marveling at the tiny being who held such immense potential. Whatever the future held, he knew that their lives and the hope of the universe would never be the same. The pulse of Unity Station thrummed through David's bones as he cradled his newborn daughter. The tiny being in his arms radiated an energy he couldn't quite comprehend, her presence a beacon of hope amidst the chaos of the past few hours. Suddenly, Lyra's eyes fluttered open, revealing irises that seemed to shift like kaleidoscopes. Her gaze locked onto David's face with an intensity that took his breath away. In that moment, he felt a connection far deeper than he'd ever experienced, even with Adassa. "David," Adassa whispered, her voice tinged with awe and a hint of fear. "Look!" He tore his eyes away from Lyra's face to see what had captured Adassa's attention. His jaw dropped as he watched his daughter's body change before his eyes. Lyra's limbs elongated, her features sharpening and maturing at an impossible rate. Dr. Teprell rushed to their side, medical tricorder in hand. "Fascinating," she murmured, her Vulcan composure slipping for a moment. "The child's cellular structure is in a state of constant flux. She's aging months in a matter of minutes." As if to punctuate the doctor's words, Lyra's body stretched and grew, her infant onesie straining at the seams. Within the span of an hour, she had the appearance of a toddler, her eyes bright with an intelligence that belied her physical age. "Mama," Lyra said, her voice clear and strong. "Papa, I understand now." Before David or Adassa could respond, alarms blared throughout the medical bay. Dr. Gaymore burst through the doors, his scaled face flushed with excitement. "The conference is starting," he announced. "Admiral Stevens has gathered representatives from Earth, Bajor, and even the genetic purists. They're convening in the main hall to discuss the implications of Lyra's birth." David exchanged a glance with Adassa, both of them acutely aware of the weight of the moment. As they prepared to join the conference, Lyra tugged at David's sleeve. "I need to be there," she said, her voice carrying a gravity that sent chills down David's spine. "They need to see me." Before anyone could protest, Lyra's form shimmered and vanished. Panic gripped David's heart as he realized what had happened. Somehow his daughter had teleported herself away. The scene in the conference room was one of hardly restrained chaos. Representatives from various factions argued heatedly, their voices rising above the general din. Admiral Stevens stood at the head of the table, attempting to maintain order. Suddenly, a hush fell over the room. In the center of the table stood Lyra, now appearing to be around 7 or 8 years old. Her presence commanded attention, and every eye in the room was fixed on her small form. "I see your fears," Lyra began, her voice resonating with an otherworldly timbre. "I feel your hopes. The conflict that divides you is born of misunderstanding and fear of the unknown." As she spoke, Lyra's body continued to age and grow. By the time she finished addressing each faction's concerns, she appeared to be a young woman in her late teens. "We stand at a crossroads," Lyra continued, her gaze sweeping the room. "The path forward is not through division, but unity. I propose a solution that addresses the concerns of all parties." David and Adasa arrived at the conference room just as Lyra began outlining her plan for a new colony world. They watched in awe as their daughter, now a fully grown woman, articulated a vision of interspecies cooperation that left even the most hardened delegates speechless. Victor Graves, the leader of the genetic purists, stood up abruptly. His face was a mask of conflicting emotions as he addressed Lyra directly. "You speak of harmony," he said, his voice rough with suppressed feeling. "But how can we trust that this isn't some ploy, that your kind won't overrun us, replace us?" Lyra turned to face him, her eyes filled with compassion. "Your fear is understandable, Mr. Graves. But look at me. I am the bridge between worlds, not the end of either. The potential within me, within all of us, is limitless when we work together." As the conference progressed, David noticed a shift in the room's energy. The hostility that had permeated the air began to dissipate, replaced by a cautious optimism. Even Graves seemed less combative, his brow furrowed in deep thought. Admiral Stevens seized the moment, working with the delegates to draft what would come to be known as the Unity Accords. Hours passed in a blur of negotiation and compromise, with Lyra serving as a living example of what was possible. As the final signatures were applied to the document, David felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He looked at Adasa, seeing his own mix of pride, love, and astonishment reflected in her eyes. Lyra approached her parents. Her aging process finally stabilized. She appeared to be in her mid-20s, her features a perfect blend of human and Bajoran characteristics. "We did it," she said, embracing them both. "This is just the beginning." In the days that followed, plans for the new colony world, christened Harmony, began to take shape. David, Adasa, and Lyra found themselves at the center of a whirlwind of activity as news of the Unity Accords spread throughout the galaxy. As they stood on the bridge of Unity Station, watching the first wave of colonist ships approach Harmony, David reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them to this point. What had begun as a forbidden attraction between a professor and his student had blossomed into something that would change the course of galactic history. Lyra placed a hand on her father's shoulder, her touch conveying a depth of understanding that went beyond words. "The real work starts now," she said, her eyes fixed on the growing planet below. "We have a chance to build something truly extraordinary." David nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility and the thrill of possibility in equal measure. As Harmony grew larger in the view screen, he knew that their story was just the beginning. The challenges ahead would be immense, but so too were the opportunities. With Adasa by his side and Lyra leading the way, David stepped forward into an uncertain but hopeful future. The age of isolation was ending, and a new era of interspecies cooperation was dawning. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, as a family and as pioneers of a brave new world.
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.